Live, I'm Josh Sepps. Hundreds of sex workers took to the streets of Amsterdam yesterday to protest an urban rejuvenation project that would close window brothels in the city's red light district. The demonstrators presented Amsterdam's mayor with a petition to save their workspaces. How could pushing prostitution underground affect the sex workers in Amsterdam, and how do their policies compare to other countries around the world? To discuss, we're joined by Crystal Du Bois, Managing Director of the Sex Workers Project at the Urban Justice Centre, Julie Ravolo, researcher with the Observatory of Prostitution, Lyle Munns, a sex worker in Amsterdam who's a spokesperson for Proud, and Manisha Shah, Associate Producer of Public Policy at UCLA. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Feel free to jump into the conversation whenever you want to. You don't necessarily have to wait till I ask you a question. But Lyle, just kick us off here and explain exactly what the city is proposing. How would it affect sex workers?
So the city has been closing down many brothels over the past few years. There used to be 500 brothels in Amsterdam. In 2007, they started a project called Project 1012, by which they closed down 100 windows. It led to many sex workers being forced to work in the gray zone. And nowadays, they want to, even though despite that happened, they want to close down 80 windows more. And that's what we're protesting against.
Why is it happening?
A very good question. I think that's a question you should be asking the municipality. What they basically say is that they want to gentrify the neighborhood. They want to get rid of the sex image that Amsterdam has on one side. And they say that cases of abuse have been taking place in the red light district, which is, to me, a strange argument, since forcing the sex workers to work in the gray zone, working on the internet, offers the municipality and the government a lot less tools of control, and cases of abuse and human trafficking can flourish there.
Now, for people who haven't been to Amsterdam, what we're talking about is basically people who are standing in front of a window where you can see them from the street, so you can actually take your choice of who you might want to hire as you walk past. Is this simply a matter of closing those windows but leaving the brothel intact, or is it about closing the entire brothel down?
The windows are the brothel, so they want to close the entire brothel down. And those women, of course, don't stop working. They go and work in other cities. They go and work on the internet. They go and receive clients at their place, which is a big problem, because for many people around the globe, hosting women in windows like we're doing here in Amsterdam might seem strange, but it's actually one of the safest workspaces to have. There are alarm buttons in those windows. The police is nearby. The health services know exactly who is working, where, when they're working. So a lot of facilities are offered in those places, which makes sure that these are one of the most healthy and safe workplaces we have for sex workers in the world. Closing those down endangers the working position of those ladies.
What has your experience been as a sex worker in Amsterdam? What are the conditions like?
Well, I'm an escort, so I'm not working in a brothel. There are not guys working behind the windows, sadly. I'm working as an escort, so I go to my clients. I'm registered at the Chamber of Commerce. I pay taxes. So in many ways, I have a lot of obligations, just as any normal employee, but still I get discriminated a lot. For example, in the financial services, or when it comes to insurances, we see that being a sex worker still offers a lot of difficulties to many of my colleagues and myself.
If you have a successful and safe career without working behind a window, why can't the sex workers who are in these window brothels simply do what you do?
Well, actually, I did have some issues with clients who didn't pay, or I felt at certain times dangerous. I think working behind the windows would offer me a lot more security than I have right now. Because there hasn't been a history of working behind the windows for men, it's simply not possible for me. But apart from that, it also has to do with a certain kind of assertiveness. You know, I have working experience for 3 years. I know if a client calls me, whether it's a reliable person or not. I have certain filters that I use in order to make sure that clients get in or not, and that they're reliable or good people. I'm not sure that all sex workers have those filters, that they are as assertive as I am with the experience I have. Well, for those sex workers who are less assertive, who are more vulnerable to abuse situations, the red light district offers a safe work environment.
Manisha, jump in.
I would say it's just really exciting to have Lyle on this panel. So often in the discussion about sex work and the related topic of sex trafficking, we never actually seem to hear from the people we're purporting to help or put out of business. And I think that, it's instructive to return in this conversation or any about these topics to say, what do the sex workers involved in this have to say for themselves and what do they want? And this is a group of people globally that is generally reticent to put their faces on camera. That's why in Rio as well in Amsterdam, you see a lot of people in masks. But anytime that I've actually seen them get together and put their agenda out there and say what they want, they say they want safer working conditions.
Yeah, Crystal, I was struck by the Oregon chapter of your organization was a little bit upset because I was looking at a conference or a hearing that the state held into sex work, and there were no actual sex workers who were represented. It was simply policymakers who were portraying all sex workers as victims.
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct. And Julie and Lyle both are totally correct that many times policies are made that do not take sex workers' lives into account. And it sounds like that's exactly what's happening in Amsterdam, where workplaces are being shut down without the consultation of sex workers and people who do dignified work and earn a living putting food on the table for their families, and their workplaces are being shut down. And I think in any industry, if this was happening, we would see an organized labor force and business owners very upset about this and demanding to be included in a dialogue that has to do with their livelihoods.
Manisha, you study public policy. What do we know about the impact of criminalisation or decriminalisation or legalisation in the sex work industry?
Yeah, so I've been involved in a rather large study the past few years looking at the impacts of decriminalization in Rhode Island. So a lot of people don't know about this, but in 2003, Rhode Island actually decriminalized indoor prostitution, basically because a judge interpreted some laws that had been written in 1980. And the way those laws had actually been written is that they had criminalized street prostitution, which was, a big problem in the 70s and 80s. But over time, the way at least the sex market has changed in the United States is it has become much more indoor focused in that it's more, online, the escort market, massage parlors, et cetera. And so what we have there is, for kind of data junkies, we have a very nice natural experiment where we can look pre-post, 2003 in Rhode Island, and we can either use the rest of the United States as our control group, or we can use northeastern states as our control group and actually look at some of the impacts of what decriminalizing did. And what we find is, so decriminalizing in Rhode Island, it definitely does increase the size of the indoor sex market in that you see new massage parlors cropping up, you see more women advertising online. But interestingly, what happens, so the two outcomes we look at, in terms of public policy, the things we always hear about associated with sex markets are sort of disease outcomes, public health issues, and violence. And so we look at gonorrhea incidents. We use CDC data over time, and we actually find decreases in gonorrhea incidents in Rhode Island once Rhode Island decriminalizes. And then we also look at rape offenses over time. We use the FBI Uniform Criminal Reports data. And again, we find about a 30% decrease in rape offenses post-decriminalization. So at least from kind of the things that we seem to care about are, in terms of public health outcomes, violence issues, decriminalization is actually reducing these outcomes.
Right, that presupposes... Yeah, sorry, jump in, Lyle.
Yeah, if I could add up to that, here in Amsterdam, for example, in the red light district, the HIV epidemic that we used to have has been decreased to a level that the average Amsterdam students are more likely to are affected by HIV/AIDS than the sex workers are. And that's simply because health agencies know exactly who those women are. They go and test, they check whether the safety conditions that are put in place are being followed. So the working space that we have here in the red light district, that we know who these ladies are, that we know where they're working, when they're working, offers a great amount of opportunity for governmental institutions and for health agencies to decrease the amount of the spread of STDs, which they obviously do not have on the internet, where you have millions of profiles hanging around and where we don't exactly know who those ladies are and where they're working and when they're working. So I think having those safe workspaces here in Amsterdam offers a great opportunity. And this has been shown in many statistics in order to prevent cases of abuse, but also from the health perspectives.
Julie, Manisha was talking about how we can use sort of some states as a control group and then look at the consequence of decriminalisation in other states. Of course, we can look across the world at different countries as well. My home country of Australia has legalised prostitution, and sex workers have to go and get regular tests for STIs, and the rate of sexually transmitted infections has plummeted, and the safety of sex workers has been improved. What's the situation in Brazil, and how can we compare these different jurisdictions?
So briefly, Brazil has the act of prostitution is legal. The law criminalizes any third party who benefits from that transaction, which is problematic because that would include pimps as well as security guards. It also prohibits women from working together, as opposed to, in the U.S., you're starting to see sex workers being prosecuted for trafficking their flatmate, which is absolutely insane. So Brazil had a sex worker rights movement that started in the 1980s with this woman, Gabriela Leite. I'm obsessed with her. Rest in peace, Gabriela. And it was because of that movement that they were able to achieve a lot of civil rights for themselves. Prostitution is a federally recognized category of employment. But going back to the health issue, it also, Brazil had several decades of partnership between the Ministry of Health and the Brazilian network of prostitutes. And is considered to have one of the best anti-HIV and AIDS programs in the world because of the way they engage that population, not just for condom distribution, but for saying you have a profession, and there are issues of stigma as well that play into this pretty heavily. So you could look at different geographies and see what's going on there. But I would also maybe bend our minds a bit and look at the porn industry. There's this artificial barrier between porn stars and prostitutes when they're both forms of sex work. And we can look in the U.S. and look at what's happened now that we've had several decades of a mostly legalized porn industry. In California, for example, the question is whether the industry is now too regulated, and whether voters in California should be deciding whether professionals use condoms in porn films. And so I don't think I think that there's sometimes artificial divides, and we need to use a little bit of common sense and say there's examples right under our feet. Porn consumption in the U.S. is a completely normative, commonplace activity, but we tend to view those two categories of sex workers as somehow alien to each other.
Crystal, so let's talk about the legal classifications here. It's interesting that we compare porn, that Julie's comparing porn with prostitution. Just unpack the difference between decriminalising and legalising sex work.
Sure. First, I'd like to mention that it's really exciting to hear our international allies talk about the kinds of things that are happening between government health workers and law enforcement. Here in New York, it's very different. As a matter of fact, criminalization is a major problem for people accessing health and safety, and carrying condoms can be used as evidence of prostitution. So sex workers are reluctant to carry the amount of condoms they need in fear of being arrested. And so we have a very different, although there are problems in other international cities, here in New York, we have very different problems where we're not even on the same page as government health workers, and our sex workers are completely unable to access those protections from law enforcement. Legalization and decriminalization are different, and there are different legal frameworks all over the world. In some places, it's illegal to buy sex. In some, it's illegal to sell. In some, it's only illegal to own a business, a sex work business. But one thing that we can see, and decriminalization just means that we stop arresting people. And so we do advocate at the Sex Workers Project for decriminalization immediately in order to alleviate the kind of suffering that our clients at the Sex Workers Project are reporting in terms of abuses by the police and not having access to justice. And legalization would be other steps further that included creating rules and regulations around how sex work is performed.
Right, so decriminalisation would just mean that instead of a sex worker being arrested, they might be given a fine. It might be more akin to a parking ticket than to a criminal offence, right? But it wouldn't actually set up a structure of regulation that would ensure the safety, both in terms of sexually transmitted diseases and in terms of avoiding abuse from clients for sex workers themselves.
That's right. Decriminalization would mean that we stop arresting sex workers, and we basically allow them to have access to law enforcement when they are victims of crime, when they are trafficked, or when they do experience abuse. They can go forward to the police without fear of arrest. And that's one of the most important things that sex workers tell us that they need is access to criminal justice and law enforcement.
Our viewer, sorry, jump in.
I think it's it's worth mentioning as well, an obvious fact for these panelists, but one that the general public doesn't, there's this elephant in the room, which is the sex trafficking conversation. I've yet to meet a sex worker who is pro-sex trafficking. If anything, sex workers are the group of people that are the most vulnerable to being trafficked or being in exploitative working or coercive working conditions because they're actually sex workers. So this idea that some 13-year-old girl from the suburbs of Chicago gets taken overseas is myth. The people who are actually suffering these kinds of violences that the world is now up in arms concerned about are sex workers themselves. And I think it bears mentioning that the roots of the anti-trafficking movement some of the same leaders of that movement were actually the same women who led the war on pornography in the U.S. in the late 60s. It was a 1973 court case that ruled it a free speech issue. They got together and turned their agenda on prostitution in the third world. And this bears mentioning because those two ideologies are quite similar. The first is that pornography is inherently exploitative towards women, so it should be abolished. Good luck with that with the internet. By the way, that's a really heteronormative framework because nobody's talking about male sex workers as victims. And that's the exact same problematic framework that is now being used to push policies globally that criminalize sex work. The ideology is that all sex work is inherently objectifying towards women. Again, men are never mentioned in the conversation. Therefore, we should get rid of it. So you've really got to be careful. In Rio de Janeiro, for example, with the upcoming World Cup and Olympics, that agenda to save the victims was actually used as a repressive mechanism by the city government and the police to make conditions worse for prostitutes. There was an unheard of series of raids. Hundreds of women, if not thousands, were displaced. There was extreme police violence and gang rapes against some of the women that were never brought to justice. And I think it's worth popping out the frame a bit and putting the discussion we're having in the context of a much more problematic one that wants to see Amsterdam shut down in the name of saving the women who work there.
Well, Julie, it's interesting because Manisha earlier said that, when you look at the metrics of all of the things that we care about in terms of, the health of sex workers, in terms of reducing crime, in terms of lowering STIs, STI transmission, then decriminalisation and legalisation are an obvious policy to pursue. But that presupposes that those are the things that we actually care about. It's entirely possible and likely, I think, that public policymakers actually have smuggled into this conversation an ethical judgment, a moral judgment, right? So we're not just looking at practical outcomes. This is mixed up in the same way that the drug war is, and in the same way, as you say, that the war on pornography is, in a whole bunch of preconceptions.
It's particularly insidious because who would be pro-sex trafficking? It's really insidious because it puts sex workers against the anti-sex trafficking movement. But Manisha, you might be able to speak.
I wanted to say exactly that from there's other issues, right, that are important when we make public policy. And so for a lot of people, for example, these types of markets might be morally repugnant. Just to give you another example, in 2009, I think one of the reasons that indoor prostitution was ultimately recriminalized in Rhode Island, the reason it got through was precisely this human trafficking argument that you're making, is that people started arguing, ever since, prostitution was decriminalized in 2003, we've seen this increase in human trafficking. Unfortunately, as someone who works with data and runs a lot of regressions, the problem is that there just isn't good data out there on human trafficking. Exactly. So it's really hard to know what's going on because we just don't know. And so there's a lot of claims being made. But I think, one of the things that would be great to, would in an ideal world, we would actually be able to quantify this and see whether or not this is actually the case.
Although, one thing we could quantify, although I don't have the numbers, is that the U.S. for over a decade now, the State Department has only handed out funding to NGOs abroad to fight HIV and AIDS if they signed an anti-prostitution pledge. This is actually federal policy that these organizations had to sign an anti-prostitution pledge and promise that they wouldn't use any of the funds to give sex workers condoms. It's absolutely absurd. So the Supreme Court ruled that unconstitutional in the U.S. last year for the State Department to take that stance with American-based NGOs that do work against HIV and AIDS abroad. But I give that as one small anecdote, which is actually billions of dollars worth of anecdote, to look at how a moral agenda is being used to impact people in all sorts of parts of the world that we're purporting to try to help, right?
In the context of this conversation around the conflation of sex trafficking and sex work and the perception of all sex workers as being victims, there's currently a social media campaign in Australia which I want to take a look at, which is sex workers pushing back against that stereotype. Here's an article in the BBC which is trending called "The Faces of Prostitution." In Australia, it recounts a pro-sex worker campaign which was started by a sex worker and history graduate named Tilly Lawless, involving things like this, just pictures of ordinary people with hashtags saying sex work is work, hashtag rights not rescue, hashtag faces of prostitution. Here's another one that says, look at my life, I'm treated poorly, there is no umbrella to protect me from UV, please save me, hashtag faces of prostitution. Lyle, our viewers comment as they watch this online. Just take a look at this comment from Kira. She says, if more and more of these brothels are shut down, what do you foresee happening in these grey areas? Those areas will just become more dangerous for everyone, right?
Yeah, exactly. I would completely agree with that. That's what we have been seeing that was going on here in the Netherlands, not only in Amsterdam, but in the entire countries. They have shut down many brothels on this human trafficking argument mostly. And what basically happened, and many of my colleagues ended up in the gray zone. They ended up working on the internet, working at home, which is not regulated here in the Netherlands, where they basically didn't have the facilities, the kind of facilities that were offered in the red light district or at other brothels. And I put them in unsafe conditions. I talked to women saying that I feel a lot less safe. I have a lot less access to health services. I have a lot less access to social services. And I don't know basically what to do. And even more recently, there were certain cases of sex workers minor of age being forced into prostitution, working on the internet. And the police, yes, they discovered what was going on, but they say it's too difficult to check out on all those profiles. Yet, although the internet is playing a more and more important role, and it's difficult to have oversight on the internet, the municipal governments here in Holland are shutting down regulated workspaces and are forcing more people into the internet, making it even less insightful for politicians to control and to verify. So I would completely agree with everybody saying that forcing sex workers in the gray zone forms a huge threat to their employment status.
Crystal,
I think another.
Sorry, Lyle, carry on.
I think another important perspective that we haven't mentioned just yet, and I believe is very important, is perspective from the clients, because you obviously can look policy-wise from the perspective of the sex workers. What does it do to their well-being? What does it do to their health? But I think it's also important to look at clients. In many of the anti-sex feminist rhetorics, clients are being put away as bad people, as those dirty old perverts who want to abuse women. I think that's simply not true. That doesn't correspond with the experience that I have, and especially not with the experience that many of my colleagues have. I get to meet many people who end up who are in very vulnerable situations, who can't talk about their sexuality, who find themselves in a society that claims to be very liberal, but still in 2015 finds it difficult to talk about sexuality as if it were a normal issue. Those clients find it difficult to deal with their sexuality. For that reason, because they can't find sex in a conventional way, they end up at sex work. Well, I think they deserve a place in this debate as well, and they're often overlooked. And they are often labeled as being pervert old people with bad needs.
In fact, Julia, I was just going to jump in and say that, it often in some of the more enlightened countries and enlightened jurisdictions, that's precisely what happens. The sex workers are regarded as the victims who shouldn't be punished, but the clients are gone after. Even in Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Norway, for example, there's a crackdown on the clients. Is that unwise?
I think it's find any profession that wants to see their clients criminalized. Find a hairdresser who wants to, you can't have a hair salon anymore, so you've got to sneak around and do it in a client's home and put yourself at risk of what happens when you go cut their hair in their home. I think that one of the kind of misconceptions that maybe we can unpack is that clients are the slave masters. I mean, some people are actually using that kind of heavy language to say these guys are evil devils repressing women. Again, no mention of men across the world. When you talked about the agenda that people generally talk about with what matters as relates to policy and sex work, the big legacy issue is STDs and HIV/AIDS. The other issue is violence. But we tend to, the conversation seems to be wrapped around violence that women suffer or men in the hands of their clients. I would venture to say that in Brazil, the long legacy, and I'd be curious to see if this is the case in other parts of the world, is police violence. Mm-hmm. And the biggest complaint is about police violence. Mm-hmm. And you can't have police violence when you have a regulated, well-lit industry in the same way that you can when something is illegal or quasi-legal, or society in general looks down on the people who are doing it anyway and says things like sex workers can't be raped because you can buy sex from them. Those are some really problematic things. And police violence is something very real that flourishes the more you push sex work into the margins. And in fact, over World Cup in Brazil, in Rio specifically, which people thought was going to be the sex trafficking bonanza of the century, because Rio has such a strong sex tourism industry, as much for gay as for straight clients. The biggest issue in Rio that the Observatory of Prostitution tracked, with over 2,000 hours of research in the field, was police violence.
Crystal, I've just noticed a comment from one of our viewers. Javier Santana says that Times Square and really all of 42nd Street was a dump in the 80s with XXX shops, etc., until it got cleaned up. And look at it now, it's a tourist destination. I fully support Amsterdam's Project 1012. You live in New York. What's wrong with that?
I prefer the old Times Square myself. It's sort of a nightmare for New Yorkers, and we avoid it at any cost now.
Yeah, so what do we really want? Yeah, I mean, in other words, I take your point, but I mean, for tourists, it's lovely.
Okay. I mean, I think that the important thing to remember is that we're all in neighborhoods and in cities, and we try to do our best to create the best and safest neighborhoods and cities that we can. And it just doesn't work to leave out the voices of the workers whose livelihoods we're affecting in those cities and communities. So just like what's happening in Amsterdam right now, if we say we're going to shut down 30 or 40% of your workplaces, we're not going to consult you, you're now not going to be protected by the law, and you're going into these gray areas too. This doesn't make our cities and towns and neighborhoods more safe. So if we're really pragmatic, we really need to look at the research. We need to stop using these moralistic pushes that we're getting from various groups, and just let's be pragmatic about it and say, how can everyone be safe, and how can we create these cities and neighborhoods that work for everybody and all the workers, including sex workers.
You got it.
Yeah, and if I could add up to that.
Very quickly, Lyle.
The red light district is one of the most tourist places in the world, at least for Amsterdam. It's a major tourist attraction. It's a neighborhood that's very well taken care of. The municipality tries to clean it up, make it a safe, nice neighborhood. There's a lot of police going on to make sure that everybody is safe, and all the tourists coming in, that they're in a safe place to walk around. So I think it doesn't necessarily mean something bad for a city to have a sex industry, as long as it's good regulated, the women are working there under good conditions. I think it could be an advantage of your city. Gentrifying at the advance of ladies and not taking care of their opinions or their place in the city, I think that's a very bad thing to do. Simply taking away one's workplace because you want to gentrify a neighborhood and because you have a certain idea of what's good for your neighborhood, I think that's very problematic. And I think that that's conflicting with the rights of ladies.
Not to mention the fact that the red light district in Amsterdam is one small alcove in a very large and vibrant city. I've spent a whole, weeks in Amsterdam without even going there. It's not like it's everywhere. You don't have to go there if you don't want to. Thanks to all four of you for being part of the conversation. We've got to wrap it, but of course we'll be keeping our eye on what goes down in Amsterdam. Crystal, Julie, Lyle, Manisha, thanks for your time. Stay tuned, of course, to plenty more conversations coming up right here.